1 minute. We have 1 minute to meeting.
They deliver.
Okay, we call this council work session to order. City Clerk, may we have roll call, please?
Mayor Truitt,
Here.
Vice Mayor Johnson,
Here.
Councilmember Villanueva, Councilmember Alton, Councilmember Williams,
Here.
Councilmember Hall,
Here.
Councilmember Longabaugh.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to jump right into the Unified Development Code, UDC. Mr. Mahalik.
Mayor Truitt, members of City Council, good afternoon. Presented for your consideration and discussion are the last several chapters of the recommended Surprise Unified Development Code. We are clearly in the home stretch, and this will be hopefully the last work session on this topic. We're actually going to cover a lot of topics this afternoon and ask for quite a bit of policy guidance from Council. It should be some interesting discussion because we'll be talking about parking, not only at Culver's, but at other places, landscaping, lighting, and then also the streamlining, which I presented back in December, but just a couple points of emphasis on that as well. The parking and loading recommendations are included in Chapter 9. It includes some new things, including maximum parking space numbers, defined uses, and also some opportunities for shared parking, and that really does speak directly to the Culver's issue. Almost every parking code throughout the United States will have minimum parking space requirements. It's typical, but not many of them have maximum parking space requirements. And this is important to prevent the picture that you see in the top left corner, and that's real large vacant parking lots. When you have large vacant parking lots, you'll have a lot more runoff, stormwater creation, and you really can create an urban heat island effect, especially in a climate like Phoenix. So our code includes both minimum and maximum parking space standards. We're also recommending that you allow some shared parking requirements. Those ratios are based not just on land uses, but also the times, the peak travel times. Best way for me to describe that is to show you an overhead graphic. Here are some land uses right next to each other: a health club, a daycare, and a large office complex. And if you think about when are the popular times to frequent these establishments, a health club is busy in the morning, in the evening, and on the weekends. Daycare, somewhat similar. Again, morning, early afternoon, not on the weekend at all. But offices are the complete opposite. They're full Monday through Friday during the day, but very rarely are they there on Saturdays and Sundays. So the concept is when you have these types of land uses all lined up together, we should consider giving parking credits for this. What it does is it allows shared parking opportunities. It allows someone to park in one spot and then go to the other uses. For example, if a person is parked here at the office complex and they work there, they can take the path, they can drop off their child, and also go to the health club. So if you're going to be using a shared parking arrangement, it's strongly recommended that you also use pedestrian connections between them. But again, this avoids having large expanses of parking lot that no one will ever use. So the first question is, do you agree with the maximum parking space concept and also the shared parking allowances?
Absolutely a wonderful idea. I was very successful where I came from in California. There was the same thing with a lot of the electronic plants that they would have a gym in the area or whatever, and they never had overcrowding in the lots, and it worked out very well. It should work well here, too.
Yeah, I totally agree with it, Jeff.
Have we looked at some of the larger retail establishments in the city to see what how the maximum might have impacted them?
We have done a case study. We actually took a look at Sam's Club, and we frankly think they're a little overparked. There's going to be a lot of spaces that aren't used. The trick, though, with uses like that and Walmart and some others, unfortunately, is that during their tremendous peak time, and that's the week after Thanksgiving, during the shopping season, they need those parking spaces, generally speaking, but the rest of the year, they're quite empty. And I'm still recommending that you shy on the side of being more conservative and asking for less parking instead of more.
Do any of those big boxers have minimum parking requirements? So they say if we're going to put in so many 100,000 square foot store, we need to have X number of parking spaces?
They do. There's almost always corporate standards for parking, but these standards would still be within their threshold.
Okay. Anything else? I think generally you've got consensus.
Thank you. We spent quite a bit of time on landscaping as we updated the SUDC, both in terms of enforcement, which took a very careful look at species, and also the planting requirements. This part is, I think, very unique, and landscape architects on staff came up with this concept, and it's a great one. And that's using our scenic integrity guidelines to make recommendations for planting schemes for landscaping. And if you think about the City of Surprise, not only currently how we're developed, but also how we're going to develop in the future as we go to the west and to the north, there are certain landscape communities that simply will not do well if you plant them in certain areas. Best way to describe that is we've broken up the City of Surprise into these scenic integrity areas, and those are the names that we have. There's Custom, Sonoran Mountains, Bahada, Sonoran Uplands, just to name a few. And each of those areas have different topographic features that really lend itself to doing certain types of landscaping. The Sonoran Uplands, which is the graphic on your top left, shows the area that has a lot of relief. It has some washes. And the graphic of the landscape materials is really representative of what will survive in that environment. On the bottom is Custom, and it's just the way it sounds. That's the type of environment and landscaping opportunity that you would see in like the Marley Park area. It's very ornamental. But here's the trick. If you tried to do a custom type of landscape palette and you tried to do that in the Sonoran Upland area, two things would happen. One, the plant communities would unlikely survive over time, but two, we'd be spending a lot of time and money watering it, whether it's public or private. And that's, in my suggestion to you, a big waste of water. So when landscape plans are submitted to us, we'll review the scenic integrity guidelines to make sure that the planting that they're proposing fits in with the character of the topography. Okay? Also, we took a real close look at any pollen-producing trees, and we're recommending that olive trees and mulberry trees are prohibited. We actually get quite a bit of complaints from residents about that. The other thing we get complaints about is the use of thorny plants and cacti adjacent to pedestrian areas. I think we've made that mistake throughout the community, and I have to deal with those phone calls about poor kid falling off his big wheel into a thorny shrub, and they end up ripping him out. So we're recommending to keep those away from pedestrian areas. So the broad question is, do you agree with those landscape material guidelines, the character, and probably most importantly, the placement?
My question is, if we were to take these guidelines and apply them to Vistancia, would they work? Because in my opinion, Vistancia is one of the nicest landscape communities that's relatively close to Surprise.
It would work. It would work there.
The thorny bushes or
The thorny bushes are okay, and they work well, but they just have to be pushed further away from playground equipment, sidewalks, and bike paths.
how many feet?
10 feet.
10 feet?
Yep.
Anything else? Okay, and is this something that's been discussed with the, I think I'm probably on a different track, but the Home Builders Association?
Yes. In fact, we developed this in-house with a landscape architect. We put it out to all the stakeholders, and landscape architects that work for residential home builders and commercial developers have looked at this and provided us comments, and we've modified the code to address their comments.
Okay, so we can expect that if there's this type of vegetation on something that's being developed, then they will protect and preserve that vegetation, maybe relocating it, but keeping it.
They can do one or both. Yeah, what we're recommending is that wherever possible, that they preserve the landscaping as it is, the native vegetation, but there are cases where they can actually pick it up and relocate it. The other issue that we have in the City of Surprise is enforcement of landscaping. So we created some language that provides guarantees, warranties, and maintenance guidelines. The pictures will show you the issues that we deal with. These are all in the City of Surprise. The bottom left picture shows some diseased and dying trees along the parkway. The bottom right picture shows what happens when a irrigation system malfunctions and the erosion that's created. And the top right picture is what happens after a good windstorm. And it's difficult for us to go out and ask people to replace these trees right away. So we've enforced that language in the draft code to you. The other thing I think is very important is to really limit where we allow turf in the city of Surprise in the future. And we're saying that turf is fine, but it really should only be used in recreational areas only, again, active recreational. So this is an example of a turf area in a drainage channel, and that, again, it really doesn't provide any good active recreational use, wildlife corridor, or anything. Unfortunately, people in some of these situations feel the need to water these things. That's a waste of water. But certainly in situations like this where there's an active play area, then turf is actually recommended. And these areas will also try to provide reclaimed water where possible and extend that reclaimed water system over time. So again, we're recommending that turf is only used in active recreation areas.
Jeff, excuse me. There is a plot of grass in the median in front of Sun Village. Isn't there? Don't we have grass?
The median, yes.
The median?
Yes.
Now, what would happen to that?
That would be a legal that specific application is legal non-conforming use. It would stay there. But over time, we would like to transition those and do more of a non-turf treatment. For new developments, those would not be allowed. Okay. Another issue we have, and this is a little bit of fine-tuning, but it does have a purpose, is to provide better edge treatments around landscaped areas. You can see here that the developer used real poor edging material, either plastic or some sheets. Those create problems. They create trip and fall hazards. Aesthetically, they're not very pleasing, and also creates maintenance issue because some of this fine gravel and rock becomes portable over time and creates some issues. So we're recommending that we use concrete headers that provides a much cleaner transition between the landscaped areas and less landscaped areas, and also keeps all the material where it's supposed to be and creates less trip and fall hazard. Here's another issue I think we can all appreciate, and that's drainage channels. This is not in the city of Surprise, but it's nearby where it conveys water. It definitely has the drainage capabilities, but in terms of aesthetics, it's not very appealing. And in fact, I would argue that this could be an attractive nuisance for kids, whether they're skateboarding and so forth and so on. So we are not recommending this. Our recommendation is that you use this type of drainage channel treatment. You have the hardscape in the bottom. It can convey the stormwater. It has plenty of capacity, but you can make it look nice. It's an attractive treatment.
Jeff, what is that in front of Belmar? Is that us, or was that the county?
That's actually the county.
That's the county.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
But even if it's a development that is required by the county to do a treatment like that, because they have to go through our review and approval process, we can work closely with the county to make sure that the new detention areas match our standards and still meet their standards at the same time.
Okay.
But retrofitting those would be very difficult, frankly.
Oh, yeah.
The new code also talks about front yard landscaping. By and large, the City of Surprise has really nice landscaping in the front yard, but there are a handful of communities, I'm sure you're familiar with them, that there's no landscaping whatsoever in the front yard. Okay? The new SUDC requires that each new home have trees, shrubs, and some ground cover. Not an extensive palette out front, but at least a couple trees, a couple shrubs, and some ground cover. It's really important for curb appeal. The developer will be required to put that in before occupancy permit. And here's another issue I think that is challenging for us as well. This is a commercial area, and a lot of times the developers like to take their front yards, which are required, and then try to use that as their sole drainage area. This is a relatively new development. Once again, it conveys water, it provides drainage, but it's certainly not very attractive. So we're recommending that you limit this to only 50% of the front yard at a maximum, and also to landscape it. And here's actually a good example in the City of Surprise where it's in the front yard, there's drainage, there's conveyance, but it can be made to look very nice.
Mm-hmm. Now,
Also,
Jeff, can I
yes,
ask a
yes,
question? I just want to make sure I'm clear on maintenance. Between the sidewalk and the curb.
I'm coming to it in the next
You're
slide.
coming to it?
I'm coming to it, yes, sir.
Right.
We also, in the City's Price, currently have some pretty poor street landscaping standards, particularly in the park strips, which is the area between the curb and the sidewalk. Frankly, right now, the bottom left slide is allowed. There are no landscaping requirements on its face in the city of Surprise. So you can have just the DG between the curb and the sidewalk. Okay. The other issue we have is that when there have been some plantings put in, there's no maintenance standards as well. So the picture to the right shows you a tree that has been dead for quite a long time. There's really nothing that we can enforce to get that tree changed out right now. So we're recommending a number of changes to our landscaping requirements, both in private parking lots and along the street. And let me walk you through a few of these without getting into exhaustive detail. Our current standards really put a premium on very large trees planted right away. And that would seem intuitively that that's a really good idea. The bigger the better, but not necessarily the case. What we're recommending to you is that you're better off actually having a combination of different tree sizes. We're saying 50% are 24-inch, 30% are 36, and then only 20% are 48. The new standard really does enhance survivability and reduces maintenance costs, both in terms of watering and in terms of changing these things out. So you'll still have, over time, a much better impact on the street. It'll just take a little bit more time for it to mature, but the chances of survivability are much, much higher. Tree spacing along residential streets, we're also recommending the same thing. Smaller tree sizes, but better spacing, and this is a good illustration. And we're also strongly recommending that we allow street trees with less overhang. I call it RV proofing, because we get that complaint quite a bit in the city of Surprise, where the large vehicles, RVs, come by and scrape the trees. So we have a particular list of street trees that we think are appropriate along the park strips. And the other thing that's important, and we heard this from Council and the Planning and Zoning Commission as well, is to provide more and more shade. So the trees along the park strips would be shade species. It enhances walkability in that area. Now to get to your point about maintenance, is the park strip, again, between the curb and the sidewalk, the developer will be responsible for installing all of those materials in accordance with the code, in accordance with the standards I just rattled off, and then the HOA would be responsible for maintaining it. In the absence of a HOA, then the owner of the lot adjacent to it would maintain that. And that's actually a pretty typical standard nationwide. Okay? The median, however, would be a little bit different. Again, a landscape median in the middle of the road. The developer would still be required to install that landscaping to meet our standards, but the city would maintain. The reason for that is primarily public safety. You really don't want your HOA and your garden variety homeowner out in the middle of your parkway maintaining that landscaped area. Okay. So again, the developer always pays for all the material. Next to the sidewalk, they're responsible for maintaining it. In the middle of the street, it's the city. Right now, there's all different kinds of approaches in the city. It really was dependent upon the development agreement. This sets a standard. It's very clear, very definitive, and over time, everybody will know what it is.
One of my, I was around back when we went to curb separated sidewalks and thought it was the, going to be just the greatest thing. And upon reflection, I don't think it's the greatest thing. Is we see a lot of poorly maintained strips along the residential streets, and it makes the front yard smaller for the residents, and most of them aren't very well maintained. And so that's a concern. Are you suggesting that the inclusion or making it mandatory that the HOA be responsible for that maintenance is going to turn that problem around?
Yes. And if not, frankly, it's in the SUDC, and we can enforce it.
Yeah, but you got a lot of homeowners out there that were given a tree. They had no choice on what tree they were going to get, and it was probably about a 15-gallon tree. I don't think they were even a 24-inch box. They, like you said, they die, and then they just sit there, and nobody wants to take care of them, or they blow over. That was another thing, is lots of times those trees weren't staked properly, and so the first big windstorm would come and blow them over, and somebody would come out and haphazardly try to tie things off. You got lines going across sidewalks and crazy things happening out there. So I hope that we can find some kind of a standard that's going to, make sure that the integrity of the neighborhood is maintained from a landscaping standpoint, but we're not being too onerous on the individual residents.
Fair enough.
I agree. One other small point, and this is a little off point, but I need to make it right now because we're talking about this. I think we need to be sensitive to the commercial application when the orientation of the store is facing non-street.
Okay.
For instance, where let's see.
Cold's Department Store?
Payway.
Oh, okay.
Cold
Cold Stone
Stone
Creamery.
Creamery. Yeah, okay. Those trees sometimes block that signage, and they don't get the benefit of a windshield driving by. And I'm concerned that with the tree covering up a sign, we're going to hurt the business. So we need to be sensitive to that too.
Protecting view sheds of signage is definitely an issue. I'll skip ahead just a tiny bit, just touch on one thing. One thing that we're asking developers to do as part of the streamlining effort is to make sure that when they submit plans to us, they're submitting all the plans at one time. The way it works right now is they come in piecemeal. You get your building permit, you get your civil engineering, you get your landscaping, and then you get your signage. That's how we miss stuff.
Yep.
Now we're going to get it all at the same time, and we'll say, hey, look, if you're going to put this big tree right here on this spot, and we know where it's going to be, no one's going to be able to see your sign. Oh, and then we'll change it out before it's planted. Okay. All right. So I guess, did you guys agree with the drainage area, street tree edge treatment, and landscape maintenance responsibilities?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Last thing, and I think you'll appreciate this, and Surprise is so noted for its park amenities. Within the landscape ordinance, we are requiring now minimum residential amenity standards. It requires tot lot, turf field, and sports courts for new developments in the city of Surprise. They could be private or they could be public, but they have to provide that. The number, the size, and the placement is sliding. It varies based on the size and density of the development. Now we have to be very careful about this and make sure that we understand clearly whether it's private or public, but the same standards would apply. We can't differentiate if it's a public park and a private park. Kids are going to be playing there, adults are going to be recreating there. The standards shouldn't shift, okay? But if they want to take on the maintenance responsibility in private, I don't think we're going to have a problem with that as long as it's maintained to a high standard and as long as it's installed within accordance with accepted standards as well. The other thing that's very important, and this picture is more of a Midwest application, but you'll understand the point, is that recreation equipment really in retention areas really needs to make sure it's above the high water mark. In the city of Surprise, it's only going to be really an issue, frankly, during the monsoon season. But if you have a large retention area and you want to put recreational equipment there, it's okay, but get it away from the area that's going to be wet most of the year. Certain parts of the country, we don't allow recreational equipment at all in retention areas because we're inundated with water all the time. But in this desert environment, I think it's okay, but we got to move it away as much as possible from the high water area. Tot lots also, I think you all will appreciate this, would be required to have shade structures and water fountains. Because again, in this environment, if you don't have those two elements, people are not going to use them. These standards, I want to stress to you, are consistent with the Parks and Trails Master Plan that the City Council adopted about 6 months ago. And it's also consistent with the National Park Standards, which are used throughout the country. So the question is, do you agree with these new park development standards for new residential developments?
Through the chair. Just one comment, Jeff. When we're looking at these, sometimes in certain communities, they can become attractions for vandalism and criminal activity. So as we're looking at this, I like this idea, but I also want to make sure that it coincides with the lighting that you covered extensively in there. Even through PDs, they have SEPTED, community crime prevention through environmental design, making sure. And I was going to bring up the playgrounds and retention basins and that kind of thing. So I'm glad you brought that up. But just kind of being cognizant of that when we're approving plans for communities like that with these parks in them.
Our policy is to route all recreational amenities through the police department to have them comment on those issues.
Great.
Sorry, what was that?
Every time we get in a park plan, playground, any type of thing like that, we route it through the police department to make sure that they have input on safety issues.
And my question has to do with recreational services. Is this going to require more parks or more playgrounds in areas that the city owns? Because if it does, then that's going to require more maintenance, and that's going to require a budget.
Yeah. I think that we have to make those decisions, frankly, on a case-by-case basis. If we rely solely on the developer building them and turning them over to the City of Surprise, then without question, you're absolutely right, that would require more maintenance, more costs, and so on. But I would suggest to you for the next several years, we're better off making sure that they're private facilities, built to our standards and maintained by the HOA. Okay? But over time, we may want some of those parks in our control so we can program them more. But again, for now, I think we have some flexibility through development agreements and through the POD to make that call on a case-by-case basis. Okay. All right. New topic, lighting. The lighting chapter establishes standards for exterior lighting. It prohibits light trespass onto adjacent properties. This is critical. And it requires shielding of lights where necessary. I mentioned this at the last work session. All commercial lighting fixtures will be decorative if you adopt the code. And all bollards, which are primarily used along trails, should be made of concrete. And this addresses what I heard earlier, and that's really to make it as vandal-proof as possible and to make sure our maintenance goes down wherever possible. And I think we've learned on the fly on this one. Mm-hmm. This is definitely a policy question for the council and the mayor. Right now, maximum heights of light standards in the parking lots are 16 feet. We're actually recommending that you do a 25-foot lighting standard in larger parking lots, and that shows you the picture on the left. But we would recommend lowering it to 16 feet adjacent to residential and pedestrian routes. The reason for this are a couple. One, the lighting is much more efficient, and you can spread more lighting in a more efficient manner when they're taller. Number two, if you require lower lighting poles, you'll see more of them. You'll see a proliferation of light poles throughout a private parking lot. You can argue it both ways, but my experience over time is that you're better off going with fewer lights, fewer light fixtures that you can control, but put them up a little bit higher. Please remember, I just mentioned to you about the shielding requirement. If they get too high, there's some deflection into the right-of-way, there's deflection into other private properties, we can require shielding. But I would recommend going to the higher standard in larger fields of parking and lower in residential and pedestrian areas. Do you agree with these recommended exterior lighting standards?
Question, does that mean that within the context of one particular commercial development, you could have the higher standards on the interior and then lower standards on the perimeter where it's adjacent to residential?
That's exactly what it's designed to do.
Okay,
Yes.
and is the word adjacent the critical issue there, or is there some kind of a number of feet that it has to be separated from the?
That's a great question. I'll look at that. The intent is certainly to provide a transition area, but your comment about the word adjacent is a good one. I'll take a quicker look at that. Obviously, the goal is to make sure that there's appropriate lighting in the commercial areas, the active areas, but when it transitions back to residential, it starts to soften over time. So we'll take a look at that. Keep in mind, too, through the PUD process, we can require additional conditions to make that transition happen sooner rather than later.
Okay, and in some, I think in many cases we've done a pretty good job of this already. I know there's a couple issues, but always, if people want to compare the county to the city, they can just go to the Circle K and the QT on Bell Road.
I agree.
At 114th Avenue or wherever.
Oh, yeah.
And you can see that the light is on a QT. The light is contained on the property, and it's not glaring as you're driving down the street, which isn't true of the Circle K, which sits in the county. So, yeah, good lighting standards are really important.
Through the chair. The 25-foot, how does that square with the dark skies?
Dark skies really have to do more with the light fixture itself and the shielding.
Okay.
The best way to address dark skies, in my opinion, is that you make sure that I'm getting a little technical, but you make sure that the lumen or the bulb does not go below the housing. If you keep the bulb flush, we call it flush lighting, then you're not going to have that light trespass or escape. The second issue is really the intensity of the lighting as it hits the ground and illuminates the rest of the site. There are foot candle requirements within the code. I didn't want to bore you with all that detail, but that's another way to control it. So I will tell you this. Along the 303, where we're going to have a lot of commercial development, auto dealers, shopping malls, and so on, it will be virtually impossible for us to guarantee dark skies adjacent to that. It's just not practical. Okay? But we need that economic development, obviously, to drive the rest of our programs. But in areas where it transitions to residential, this code can provide dark skies.
Okay.
I'll go through this little bit quicker. Chapter 12 is the review and approval process. That includes all the entitlements, which are your annexations, rezonings, and site plans. I presented to you this in some detail in December, but the streamlined process, the bundling of permits, the bundling of cases is all part of this. Chapter 12 encourages flexible zoning through the planned unit development process, and we'll recommend that all developers use a PUD. The chapter, more than anything else, significantly streamlines the review and approval process. It's thorough, it's flexible, it's very efficient, but I want to stress to you and everybody else that it's not at the expense of quality. We're not doing that at all. But we can, through concurrent reviews, through specific review requirements within the code, we can make it go much faster. Here's a good policy question for you. In order to move even closer to streamlining, we're wanting to know if you want to do away with second readings of ordinances in order to further streamline the development review process.
Yes. What do you think?
That's a bit of a, I think maybe a bit of a political question because, or at least it is for me, because I'm thinking, are we taking away one additional level from the public to have comment? And that concerns me a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'd like to go, I probably should have gone back and tried to see where we had public comment on first and then where we came in on the second reading. I really don't know. Is that something that we could revisit, maybe do a little study on and come back, or do you need some kind of consensus tonight?
I will offer this, if it's okay. We actually did do some research on that.
Oh, good.
And we looked to see how many times there was ever a change between first and second reading. And in my tenure here with the City of Surprise, it's only happened once where there was a change of vote. And other than that, there was never a change in condition, application, or modification to an ordinance between first and second reading. And that's with almost a year's worth of application. So I don't know that you would lose a lot in terms of transparency by doing away with the second readings. Let me stress also to you that, remember, the review process and public input process for development matters is extensive. We post it in the newspaper, we post the property. There's typically a newspaper article that goes out, but more importantly, we're required by Arizona state statute to have community outreach meetings. So for a rezoning, for example, we must have a community outreach meeting in the community with the developer. So that's one time people can come forward. 2, we have the formal public hearing at the Planning and Zoning Commission level. 3, you have your public hearing before the City Council. And then 4, you could have your adoption. So there are multiple times for public input, and that's even with doing away with the second readings. But in terms of efficiency, it would certainly streamline the process. But we would like some feedback if possible this evening, but that's your decision, of course.
Personally, I would be willing to go with this, and then if we begin to have some issues with our public, then we need to revisit this subject.
Makes sense.
You said it would be more efficient. Is that by number of days from one council meeting to the other? Is it be at least 15 days or?
It is. It's about what it is. It's about a 15-day shortening of the window.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. A couple other things. This Chapter 13 is a summary of all the authoritative bodies, Council, Commission, Board of Adjustment, the new Quality of Life Commission, just what their role is in the development review process. Chapter 14 has been strengthened regarding enforcement. I think over the years, I'm sure you recall, we've had challenges with enforcing conditions on conditional use permits and conditions related to development agreements and so forth. Chapter 14 now makes it very clear that if someone is in violation of a condition, that there's various stages of enforcement that we can do to deal with that to make sure that those conditions that were presented to the public are indeed enforced. Chapter 15, gentlemen, those are definitions. I don't need to describe that too much. There were 2 issues that you wanted me to bring back to you. Okay, and I'll try to do this quickly for additional consideration, and I have tweaked these 2 areas. Half streets, still to this day, half streets is, of all the issues in the SUDC, which is this big, half streets is the tough one, okay? I've tweaked this based on comments from the Planning and Zoning Commission, the stakeholders, and Council. Right now, we're suggesting that to require full street improvements everywhere. Again, right out of the box, require full street improvements, okay? There are some exceptions. If the traffic impact assessment, which are required with developments like this, justifies and safety can be assured, then council could approve a half street. If the developer agrees to phase the construction of the roadway over time during the lifetime of the development, where it starts off as a half street, but before they sell the last home or sell the last tenant space, it becomes a full street, you could allow a half street. Or, and this is very much a practical issue, if the right-of-way acquisition efforts have been exhausted, you have a landowner that just will not give the right-of-way, sell it, what have you, then from a practical standpoint, we simply can't require the full street improvements, okay? But they have to prove to us that they've exhausted all those efforts. And then the only other thing is, and this is a new component that I didn't present last time, is half streets would only be approved as part of an approved development agreement, which, as you know, is approved by City Council. And as part of that, and this is something we talked about back in December, you could ask for some other upgrades elsewhere. In other words, we will work with you on your half street, okay? We may ask you to build it out over time. We may ask you to do something else, enhance landscaping. We may ask you for additional park space. We may ask you for upgraded architecture. In other words, we'll work with you on this, but you got to work with us on something else. And you can only really do this in the development agreement because it's a two-party agreement. If you try to do it as part of zoning or a conditional use permit, then you're getting into a contract zoning area, and that I'm sure Michael Bailey would have a big problem with. But the development agreement, two-party agreement, there's more flexibility. So those are my recommended changes regarding the half-street policy.
I have some concerns with that. The first is that what we're doing essentially is we're requiring the first one to develop on one side of the street to be responsible for the entire street, for the length of their development, I would suppose. Mm-hmm. And therefore, what about the second developer who comes in later on the other side of the street?
They would still be entitled to, if they get approval from City Council, to get the repayment ordinance, which you recall you just adopted a couple months ago. And now it's with interest over a set period of time. So in other words, the first guy in would build the street, but the next guy in who adds traffic to that roadway would pay for their fair share.
Okay, and that goes beyond 10 years, or it's limited to a 10-year?
15 now.
Okay.
Past the 15 years.
Yeah, so that they wouldn't be paying for everything and carry it. That would be inequitable. I agree.
Through you, Chair. I have a little difficulty with it too, and what I have difficulty is that we are now adding another reason for a builder not to build in Surprise. We have the impact fees, we have the cost of doing the road. Okay, that's an upfront cost that they're going to have to borne. At which time they're going to have to pay, if they're borrowing, they're going to have to pay some interest on it. Okay. And they probably are not going to get repaid back the interest as they're being charged. It's something, a cost of funds plus 3, or it's not LIBOR, it's Fed funds. Mm-hmm. But I can't agree with doing that and having another reason why a builder is not going to build in Surprise.
To address your issue at that point, if the developer says, I give a very practical application. Developer comes in and wants to build a shopping center. They meet our architectural standards, landscape standards. They're proposing uses to us that we need in the city, upscale retail, to name one, for example. By all accounts, it meets a lot of the city's goals, and they just cannot fund that street, the full improvement, the full street. At that point, they would come in, they would request a development agreement and request a half street. They would go through these performance standards, and if they can prove to us that they meet them, then they would be allowed to do a half street, not the full street. But again, that would come to council, and you guys could review that and make your determination at that point. If it's a small segment of roadway, if it causes traffic problems, if it's, in your opinion, unreasonable, then you would just take that portion out of the development agreement. But at that point, the developer would be brought forward to make his case, present his traffic study, and we could go from there. So I'm trying to, frankly, walk a very fine line here to provide some flexibility. But at the same time, if we give them too much flexibility, we'd have nothing but half streets.
Right.
And that has gotten us into trouble in the past.
Jeff, what did the builder say about this?
the last time I shared this language with them, they're getting more comfortable with what we're headed, but they acknowledge that we're in a tough spot with this. I think this is frankly the best we can do for now. I think we should put it in place and use it for a couple years and see how it works. And if it's not working, we could change it.
Mr. Johnson.
I think it's a great idea. Gives us flexibility to review it. And I know, like you said, Jeff, a lot of times it's gotten us in trouble. And so I like it. We can review every case-by-case basis, and if we think it's unreasonable at that time, Richard, we can say, okay, take it out of the development agreement.
I just wish we had some sort of fund where we could go ahead and do the half-street improvements, charge it back to the developers as they come in. That would really solve a lot of our problems.
Maybe when the cash registers start ringing again in the future, we'll be able to do that. But now is not the time.
Through the chair. Jeff, did you do any research on other high growth cities in Arizona?
Many communities require full street improvements.
Is that right? Okay.
Many allow half streets, and I'm trying to be right in the middle.
Okay.
Frankly.
Well, I like the flexibility,
Yeah.
but I like going in and saying, let's do full street unless these certain performances,
It does give the developer an option to come before council on that, so I think,
Yeah,
agree
but-
with that.
I'm sorry, did I cut you off? My point to that is, and that makes it a little bit arbitrary, is, if the council is saying yes to this one and no to that one, and my concern is that, that's exactly what had happened, is that the developers would come and get one decision one time and then maybe a different type of decision the next time.
Mayor Truitt, Michael Bailey and I have this conversation a lot. Every time we put performance standards in the SUDC. And the reason for that is to try to take as much of the arbitrary decision-making out as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So my recommendation to you is when you consider a development agreement and the hazard issue is brought up, that you refer to the SUDC, you look at those standards, you go down them, and we'll provide you our professional opinion on each one of those standards, and then you make your case. But you're right, if you start waffling one way or another, depending on each case, you could get yourself into some trouble. I don't think it's a big problem because, again, it's a development agreement. It's a two-party agreement. There's flexibility there. But you're right, in terms of equity, it's important to follow those performance standards as much as possible. Okay. The last one, and you guys remember a good candid discussion when we brought this up a couple months ago, and that was restricted land uses. I talked about banks and some other things, and I pulled that way back. But I am recommending to you that you restrict these land uses, and that's used car lots. And yes, sir?
Yeah, I just wanted to
Could
acknowledge
we
Mr.
back
Oliver.
up a little bit? I mean, I think that on the last one, as it relates to the half-streets, we heard Councilmember Johnson's thoughts, the mayor's thoughts, Councilmember Alton, Councilmember Villanueva. But
We didn't necessarily get
I don't think
consensus.
that there was clear direction.
in mine.
Okay.
What is the consensus on that?
I'm in favor of that.
Did you hear my thoughts?
I like your idea, actually. Personally, I think if we had had this a few years back, we'd have a few streets finished that aren't.
Now we
right
have consensus. Thank you.
Thank you. Restricted land uses, I would recommend that used car lots, and let me stress that the principal use is used car lots, not new car dealerships that have some used cars. That's a new car dealership. There's a difference. Storage facilities of any kind, vehicle storage, residential or mini storage, scrap, junkyard storage, things like that, adult uses, all three of those uses are not the kind of thing I believe we want to see on Bell Road or Grand Avenue or some of our new roads as we build out to the north and to the west. We should not specifically prohibit them. That could get us into some hot water, but I'm recommending too that they're only allowed within industrial districts and they're only allowed with a conditional use permit, which allows the Planning and Zoning Commission to put some performance standards on them. What are your thoughts? This is the last question I have tonight.
Do we have a number of feet away from different types of activities that, like the adult uses have to be? For an example, a number of feet away from a bar or a daycare center or a
In
school?
schools, yes, there are standards like that within the municipal code as it currently exists.
And are those standards stringent enough?
If I'm being candid with you on that, I would like to revisit the adult use ordinance section with Michael Bailey and the chief and tighten that up. But that in and of itself isn't part of the UDC. That's in a different part of the code.
Okay. I think this council probably would like you to do that, to visit with them and come up with a recommendation so that while we can put whatever ordinances in place that we feel are appropriate from the council.
Were you implying that Michael Bailey and the chief are experts at the adult uses, or?
Yes.
Since he's the attorney and he's the police chief, I'm not going to comment on that.
I do have a question though, Jeff. Going to the north and the west off of Grand Avenue, I don't know what that's classified. Is it over towards Ox 1? Is it going to be industrial? I think there's a whole bunch of gray area in that as to storage facilities. I know there's one or two in the works at the present time on Grand Avenue, and hopefully they will not be affected by this. But I would like to have a better description as to all the areas that are industrial areas within our boundaries of the city, so that we can have a handle on it, because that's a real gray area, I believe.
I can provide you with a zoning map.
Right. The question that I have would be that I think some of those industrial areas are also regulated by the commercial CC&Rs.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so for an example, I know that there's one area down south that's fairly new that maybe you could have an adult usage, but you can't have a church. And I think those things need to be consistent as well.
Very good.
Okay.
That is it. Unless there's any other questions or comments, we appreciate all the time. We probably spent 4 hours worth of council's time on this very important initiative, and we appreciate that. Provide us a lot of policy direction. We plan on getting this in its final form over the next couple of weeks, and we're going to present this to council in May and ask for your final adoption. If there's anything that you see, though, over the next several weeks, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I believe that concludes business for this workshop. Meeting adjourned.
Who you have to worry about?